The dream always ended in white petals, but reality always started with a boot to the ribs. In that moment, Lyra felt the air leave her lungs as she curled into the cold mud of her hovel. The floor was hard and smelled like damp earth. After that, she heard the mean laugh of Kale, a pack guard who hated her just because he could. He was a big man with a face like a crushed tin can, and he loved to remind Lyra that she was nothing. What's worse, he knew she wouldn't fight back because she thought she was a broken thing with no wolf inside her. Next, he grabbed a handful of her hair and pulled her head up so he could look at the jagged scar on her face. Still alive, little freak, Kyle sneered. He shook her head like a rag doll. I thought the cold might have finished you off. It would have saved us the trouble of looking at that ugly face of yours. Lyra didn't answer. She kept her eyes on his boots, which were covered in dried blood and filth. I am stone, she told herself. The stone doesn't feel the ice. Shadows don't feel the shame. Have you ever felt so small that you wanted to vanish into the dirt? Lyra did. She was a scavenger. She was a shadow. She was a ghost. Answer me when I'm talking to you, Kyle barked. He shoved her back into the mud. Or maybe you finally lost your voice along with your dignity. I'm awake, Kale, Lyra whispered, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. What do you want? The king's black guard is at the border, Kale spat, his breath smelling like sour meat and bad choices. They're looking for breeders to carry the royal heir. The land is rotting. I and the king is desperate. But don't worry, little freak. No one wants a vessel that's already been cracked like you. You'll stay here and rot while the pretty ones get taken to the palace. She didn't know what scared her more, the thought of being taken or the thought of being left behind to starve in this gray hole. In fact, the land was dying. The trees were rotting. The land was dying. The wolves were starving. Her mother used to tell her stories about a time when the grass was green. But those memories were like smoke now. In that moment, she remembered the story of her mother's last song, a melody that seemed to make the trees sway before the elders dragged her away. More importantly, Lyra knew she had to stay invisible because being seen meant being used. Why are you still here then? Lyra asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Ah, if the king is coming, shouldn't you be polishing your armor? I'm here to make sure the trash stays out of sight, Kale growled. He kicked a pile of dirt onto her face. Stay in this hole. If the king sees an omen like you, he might burn the whole village down just to clear the air. What followed was the sound of his heavy footsteps fading away. Even so, Lyra stayed on the ground for a long time. Deep down, she knew the truth. The king wasn't coming for love. He was coming for a body he could use. Before she could move, a horn tore through the air. It was a deep, scary sound that made her teeth ache. As the silence stretched, Lyra stood up and wiped the mud from her eyes. She had to run. Without warning, the gray trees of the forest seemed to close in on Lyra as she ran. The forest was a graveyard of gray trees, and she was just one more ghost trying to find a place to hide. Soon after, her lungs started to burn like she had swallowed hot coals. She was heading for the ravine because she knew the guards were too lazy to climb the jagged rocks. From there, she hopped over a fallen log, but her foot caught on a sharp root. Moments later, she hit the ground hard. A long, black thorn, sharp as a dagger, sliced right across her palm. Great, she hissed, clutching her hand. Just what I need. Eventually, she sat up to look at the cut, and her heart stopped. In fact, her blood wasn't red. It was silver. It glowed like a piece of the moon had fallen into her palm. It was thick and beautiful, pulsing with a light she hadn't seen in years. Not only that, but as a drop hit a dead branch, the wood began to change. A tiny, bright green leaf popped out of the bark. It looked like a miracle in a world of gray. To make things worse, she realized that if anyone saw this, she would be hunted. No, this can't be happening, she thought. The moon blessed are all dead. My mother was the last, or so they said. Have you ever had a secret so big it felt like it would burst out of your skin? This silver blood was her death sentence because the king's law said all moon blessed were property of the crown. Without thinking, she rubbed her hand into the mud, trying to hide the glow. By the time she looked up, the air had changed. With his scent in the air, she froze. It smelled like cedar wood and ancient smoke, a scent so powerful it made her wolf stir in its cage. As if fate demanded it, she stayed perfectly still. While the forest held its breath, a massive shadow fell over her. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. As the wind shifted, she realized she wasn't alone. Beneath the moonlight, she could see a pair of golden eyes watching her from the dark thicket. They weren't the eyes of a normal wolf. They were intelligent. They were predatory. They were ancient. Under the weight of his stare, Lyra felt like he was looking right through her skin, right down to the silver blood in her veins. Before either could speak, the sound of heavy boots came closer. It was the black guard, their armor clinking like a warning. As if pulled by a string, Lyra stood up and backed away. She didn't know if the wolf was a friend or a foe, but she knew the men with the swords were the end of her freedom. "There! By the ravine!" a soldier shouted. Moments later, Lyra realized she was cornered. As her wolf stirred, a low growl rose in her throat. She didn't know how to fight, but she knew how to survive. Still, she looked back at the golden eyes in the dark. "Help me," she prayed. "Please." The moment their eyes locked, Lyra felt like the world had stopped turning. She was standing in the village square now, shoved into a line with 20 other women. Every woman in the village was a prize, except for her. She was the waste left on the cutting room floor. Time stood still as the soldiers marched into the square. As if fate demanded it, the Alpha King stepped out of his black carriage. He didn't see a woman. He didn't see a mate. He saw a vessel. Caspian was huge. His fur cape was as black as a starless night, and his face was hard like stone. With his scent in the air, the space between them burned. Rather, he walked with a slow power that made everyone else look like ants. Because of that, the village elder bowed so low, his forehead touched the mud. "Great king," the elder trembled. "We have brought our finest, our strongest. Choose who you wish." In fact, the king didn't even look at the elder. Not only that, but he started walking down the line of women. What's worse, he was coming right toward Lyra. She tried to hide behind her hair, but it was no use. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop her hands from shaking. Would you sell your soul if it meant your family could eat for one more day? The girls next to her were crying or trying to look pretty, but Lyra just wanted to be a rock. Suddenly, the king stopped. Under the weight of his stare, Lyra felt her skin tingle. As if summoned, he reached out a hand. Before she could move, his fingers touched her jaw. Truth be told, his touch was hot like fire. He didn't flinch at her scar. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, her wolf stirred for the first time. When her name left his lips, she almost fell over. "What is your name, little shadow?" he asked. His voice was a low, rumbling purr. Lyra, she whispered, but I am broken, my king. You don't want me. Broken? Caspian leaned in, his golden eyes searching hers. The world is broken, Lyra. I find that things with cracks let the light in more easily. Between them, something cracked. Lyra looked at his hand. It was resting right in her white scar. Maybe it was fate, but he didn't look disgusted. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. As her wolf stirred, she saw him lean in close to her neck. He took a long, deep breath. It's because the silver blood was a beacon. She was sure he could smell it. He knew. He knew everything. You smell of old magic, he whispered, so only she could hear. And secrets. Next, he looked at the village elder and pointed at her. What followed was a silence so loud it hurt. Kyle, standing in the back, looked like he had swallowed a bee. Actually, the king didn't care about the pretty girls. At that moment, he made his choice. This is the one, the king growled. She will be my queen. She didn't know what scared her more, the look in his eyes or the way her heart answered him. Without another word, he pulled her toward his carriage. And she let it happen, knowing that her life of hiding was over. The red-eyed crow watched from the roof, a silent witness to the change. As the carriage door shut, Lyra realized she wasn't going to a palace. She was going to a war. The silk against her skin felt like sandpaper because she was used to the bite of freezing mud and rough wool. At that moment, Lyra sat on the plush velvet seat of the king's carriage, feeling like a bird trapped in a golden cage. The carriage smelled of expensive leather and old books, a scent that felt alien in her lungs. After that, she looked out the window at her village disappearing into the gray mist. She watched the only life she knew vanish, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of horse hooves and the heavy breathing of the black guard outside. Have you ever felt the world shift under your feet while you were standing perfectly still? In fact, the king sat across from her, his presence filling the small space like a brewing storm. Still, Caspian didn't look at her. Yet she felt his gaze like a brand on her soul. Without warning, the carriage jolted over a deep rut, throwing Lyra forward. Before she could move, Caspian's hand shot out, catching her by the waist. His grip was firm, his palm radiating a heat that made her silver blood hum beneath her skin. As if pulled by a string, she looked up into his golden eyes. They were focused and predatory, searching her face for a weakness she wasn't ready to show. You're trembling, Lyra, Caspian said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the very wood of the carriage. Are you afraid of the road, or are you afraid of me? Lyra swallowed hard, her throat feeling like it was full of dry sand. Instead, she pulled back, trying to put distance between them. I'm afraid of what happens when a king gets what he wants. In the ash valleys, when an alpha takes something, he usually breaks it. I am not like the alphas you have known, Caspian growled, his eyes darkening. Because he needed her to trust him, he leaned back, giving her space. My land is dying. My people are turning to ash because the moon has turned its back on us. I do not want to break you, Lyra. I want you to hold the pieces of my kingdom together. What followed was a long silence as Lyra processed his words. Still, she couldn't forget the way her mother had been treated. Truth be told, she remembered the day her mother tried to heal a dying pup, the way the elders called it witchcraft, even as the pup started to breathe again. What's worse, they used her mother's gift until it burned her out from the inside. Deep down, she knew the truth. To be a healer in a world of killers was a death sentence. Ah, my mother had a gift too, Lyra whispered, looking at the silver-tinted scar on her palm. She could make things grow. She could fix things that were shattered. But the pack didn't love her for it. They feared her. They locked her in a cellar and made her heal their warriors until she just stopped breathing. Is that what you want? A battery for your dying trees? As the silence roared, Caspian's jaw tightened. In that moment, he looked less like a king and more like a man carrying the weight of 1,000 souls. Maybe it was fate, but he reached out and touched her hand. Not with force, but with a strange, hesitant tenderness. As if fate demanded it, the tension broke. What followed was the sight of the citadel appearing through the fog, a fortress that looked like it was made of shadows. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Lyra realized there was no turning back. Moments later, the carriage came to a halt inside the fortress walls. Next, Lyra followed Caspian out into a courtyard that felt like a tomb. The air here was thin and cold, smelling of ancient stone and something metallic. In fact, the stones were laced with silver bane, a dark mineral that made her bones feel heavy. Because the stones were designed to dampen magic, her small, broken wolf let out a whimpering cry in the back of her mind. Rather, it felt like a thick blanket had been tossed over her senses. This place feels wrong, Lyra murmured, clutching her furs to her chest. It is a cage for monsters, Caspian answered, his voice echoing off the black walls. By the time they reached a massive set of oak doors, Lyra was shivering. What followed was a walk through a hallway lined with statues of ancient alphas, their stone eyes following her every move. Still, she felt like she was being watched by something more than just rock. To make things worse, she noticed a small, red-eyed crow sitting on a chandelier, its head tilting as she passed. Before she could move, Caspian stopped in front of a heavy door. "These are your chambers. My healers will come to tend to your hand and bring you food. Do not leave this room without an escort." "A prisoner, then?" Lyra asked, her voice cracking. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she felt a surge of anger. "You brought me here to be a queen, but you're locking me up like a common thief." "I am protecting you," Caspian barked, turning to face her. Because his enemies were already circling, his eyes flashed with a violent gold. "There are things in this palace that would kill you just to spite me. Do you think you're safe here? You have the blood of the moon in your veins, Lyra. To some, that is a miracle. To others, it is a feast." As her wolf stirred, Lyra stepped back into the room. In that moment, she saw the fear in him. He wasn't just a king. He was a jailer who was also a captive. What's worse, the room was beautiful, full of silks and soft furs. But it still felt like a cell. Soon after, two elderly healers entered, their faces masked in gray cloth. Without thinking, they grabbed her hand and began to wash the mud away, revealing the glowing silver cut. "It's true," one of the healers whispered, her voice full of awe. "The ichor is pure." She didn't know what scared her more, the way they looked at her blood or the way Caspian stood in the doorway, all watching her like she was the only light in a dark world. Eventually, the healers finished their work and left. As her pulse raced, Caspian remained. While the forest held its breath, he stepped into the room and closed the door. Between them, something cracked, a silence so thick it felt like physical pressure. As if fate demanded it, he walked toward the balcony, which meant she had to follow him. That night, the moon was a sliver of ice in the sky. Under the weight of his stare, Lyra stood on the balcony next to Caspian. The citadel was built on a cliff, and below them, the forest looked like a sea of dead bones. Because the land was dying, the trees didn't sway. They just groaned in the wind. What followed was the first time Caspian really looked at her, not as a king, but as a mate. "Why did you choose me?" Lyra asked, her voice a mere whisper. There were girls in the village with no scars, girls who were strong, girls who were whole. Caspian looked out at his wilting kingdom. "Strength isn't just in the muscles, Lyra. I saw the way you hid. I saw the way you kept your fire burning, even when the world tried to stomp it out. I need that fire." "And the air?" she pressed. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she felt her face heat up. "Is that all I am? A vessel to carry on a name?" As the silence roared, Caspian turned to her. In that moment, he looked almost human. Truth be told, he reached out and traced the scar on her face with his thumb. Maybe it was fate, but his touch didn't feel like a claim. It felt like an apology. Not only that, but his hand moved to the back of her neck, pulling her just an inch closer. "I won't lie to you," he whispered. "I need an heir to anchor the pack's power. Without a child of moon-blessed blood, the shift will leave us. We will become nothing but beasts, lost to the blood frenzy. But looking at you now, I realize I want more than just a vessel." "What do you want?" Lyra asked, her heart skipping a beat. "I want a reason to keep fighting," he growled. As her wolf pressed forward, he leaned in until their foreheads touched. In the span of a breath, she felt his heartbeat, fast and wild. As if fate demanded it, his lips brushed against her scar. Before she could move, he whispered into her skin, "I want you to be the queen this world doesn't deserve." But then a scream shattered the moment. Without warning, it came from the gardens below, a high, piercing sound of agony. Moments later, a fire erupted in the distance. To make things worse, the red-eyed crow on the railing let out a harsh, mocking caw and flew toward the flames. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Lyra realized the enemy wasn't just coming. They were already inside. "Stay here," Caspian ordered, his human face beginning to ripple as his wolf pushed for control. What followed was the sound of snapping bones and tearing fabric as he shifted. Next, a massive obsidian wolf stood where the king had been, his eyes glowing like suns. With every heartbeat, the screams from below grew louder. In fact, the citadel was no longer a sanctuary. And she let it happen, her hands starting to glow with a silver light she couldn't suppress. She felt it, etched in fire, the knowledge that her time of hiding was officially over. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she watched the king leap from the balcony into the chaos below, leaving her alone in the dark. What's worse, she heard a scratching at her door, a sound of claws against wood that didn't belong to Caspian. The air thickened as the lock on her door began to glow red. As if the world narrowed, Lyra realized that the Shadow's surrogate was about to become the Shadow's savior, whether she was ready or not. What followed was a silence that was even scarier than the screams. Soon after, the door exploded inward. The dust from the shattered door tasted like bitter ash and old secrets. In that moment, Lyra dove behind a heavy oak table as two wolves burst into her room. They weren't like the noble hunters in Caspian's guard. These were thin, mangy creatures with foam dripping from their jaws. Their eyes were a milky, sightless white, showing they had completely lost their minds to the blood frenzy. After that, the lead wolf lunged, its claws shredding the silk sheets of her bed like they were wet paper. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt a heat rising from her palms, a buzzing, electric energy that made the silver blood in her veins feel like liquid lightning. Have you ever felt a power so big you were afraid it would rip you apart? In fact, Lyra was terrified because she didn't know how to turn the fire off. "Stay away from me," she screamed, her voice cracking as the second wolf snarled. Next, the lead beast snapped its jaws just inches from her throat. From there, Lyra scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the cold stone floor. Still, the wolf didn't stop. It smelled her fear, but more importantly, it smelled the moon in her blood. Soon after, the wolf leaped again, its massive weight pinning her against the wall. Before she could move, her survival instinct took over. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she didn't just push, she unleashed. A wave of pure white light exploded from her chest, knocking the creature across the room. Truth be told, she didn't know she had that much anger inside her. "What are you?" she whispered to herself, staring at her glowing hands. Wait, she wasn't just a scavenger anymore. Instead, she was something ancient. Because the silver blood was a beacon, her wolf finally began to pace in the back of her mind. As her wolf stirred, she realized she couldn't stay in this room. Even so, she had to find Caspian. What followed was a quiet walk into the hallway. What's worse, the hallways were filled with the sound of fighting. At that moment, she saw a trail of glowing silver blood on the floor. It wasn't hers. It led deeper into the citadel. Maybe it was fate, but she followed it. As the silence stretched, she wondered who else was bleeding moonlight in this house of shadows. She was the blood. She was the light. She was the savior. Soon after, the silver trail led Lyra to a door hidden behind a moth-eaten tapestry. In fact, the door was made of ancient rowan wood, which felt warm under her touch. Because her blood recognized the magic, the lock clicked open without a key. Inside, the room was filled from floor to ceiling with crumbling scrolls and leather-bound books. It smelled of vanilla, dust, and old copper. This was the ancestral library. What followed was the sight of an old woman sitting at a stone table. She wore a silk blindfold, but she turned her head as if she could see Lyra perfectly. "You've come at last, little shadow," the woman said, her voice like dry parchment. "Who are you?" Lyra asked, her hand tightening on the dagger she had snatched from the wall. "I am the archive keeper," the woman replied, "and I am bleeding because the land is dying, and so am I. We are connected, Lyra. The moon, the land, and the blood." As the silence roared, Lyra stepped closer. "Caspian said I was just a vessel. He said he needed an heir to save the pack. Is that all I am to him?" "An heir is a seed, but a queen is the soil," the old woman said, reaching out to touch Lyra's scarred face. "He doesn't just need your body. He needs your light to heal the rot. Because he wants to eat the moon, Warlord Vane sent those wolves to find you. But Caspian, yeah, he doesn't realize that to save the kingdom, he might have to lose the man he used to be." Still, Lyra felt a surge of hope mixed with dread. Truth be told, she liked the idea of being more than a vessel. Next, she looked at a large book on the table. As her wolf pressed forward, she touched the pages. They began to glow with a soft, silver hum. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. She saw visions of queens who could talk to the forest and kings who fought like gods. Because she had fought for herself, she started to believe she could be one of them. But then a crash echoed from the hallway. Before either could speak, the keeper hissed, "Hide! The spy is here." She didn't know what scared her more, the sound of the approaching boots or the coldness in the air. Without warning, Lyra dove under the heavy stone table. As the sky darkened, a man in ragged furs entered the room. He didn't smell like the king, he smelled like sulfur and wet fur. In fact, he was one of Vane's men. Moments later, the spy began to tear the library apart. He was looking for the moon-blessed girl. Next, he growled, a sound that made the hair on Lyra's neck stand up. Because he was focused on the scrolls, he didn't see her. Actually, he was already partially shifted, his hands ending in long yellow claws. "Where is she, old hag?" the spy barked. "Vane wants the girl before the king can mark her." As her wolf stirred, Lyra felt a protective rage. Instead of hiding, she gripped her dagger. Without thinking, she lunged from under the table. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she drove the blade into his side. The spy roared, swinging his massive arm. Before she could move, his claws caught her shoulder, tearing her gown. In that moment, her silver blood splashed against his chest. What's worse, the blood sizzled. It acted like acid on his skin. "Ah, it burns!" the spy screamed, stumbling back. That's why she was able to push him toward the window. In the span of a breath, the spy crashed through the glass, falling into the dark gardens below. What followed was a silence so loud it hurt. Eventually, Lyra turned back to the archive keeper. "He'll tell Vane," Lyra whispered. "He saw the silver. Then the war is truly here," the woman said. As her pulse raced, Lyra felt a sharp pain in her chest. It wasn't hers, which meant it was Caspian's. In the quiet that followed, she could feel his heart beating, fast, wild, and fading. Because the bond pulsed, she knew he was in trouble. As her wolf pressed forward, she ran out of the library toward the courtyard. The tension broke as she burst through the gates. Beneath the moonlight, she saw Caspian. He was in his obsidian wolf form, but he was covered in wounds. A dozen enemy wolves surrounded him. More importantly, Warlord Vane stood at the edge of the circle. He was holding something, a silver locket. As her thoughts spun, Lyra recognized it. It was the locket her mother had worn the day she was taken. "Leave him alone," Lyra shouted, her voice booming with a power she didn't know she had. As if fate demanded it, the enemy wolves stopped. As her soul answered, she walked into the center of the fight. And she let it happen, her hands glowing so bright they blinded the monsters. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. The land was dying, the king was fading, and her heart was breaking. Still, she stood her ground. As if the world narrowed, she looked Vane in the eye. "You want the moon blessed?" she challenged. "Here I am." The air tasted like a coming storm and the metallic tang of her own magic. In that moment, Lyra stood between the dying king and the monster who wanted to eat her soul. Her hands were glowing so bright, they turned the dark courtyard into a sea of blinding silver. The snow on the ground was melting wherever the light touched it, turning the white powder into dirty slush. After that, she heard Vane's laugh, a cold, sharp sound that felt like ice sliding down her spine. He was a tall man with skin as pale as bone and eyes that looked like pits of oily smoke. He didn't look like he belonged to the earth. He looked like he belonged to the deep, dark places where things go to rot. Next, he stepped forward, twirling a silver locket between his fingers. It was her mother's locket. It was the same one she had watched her mother kiss every night before the elders dragged her into the dark. Her chest ached as she stared at the tarnished metal. What's worse, the locket was pulsing with a faint, sick green light that made her stomach turn. Do you know why I have this little moon girl? Vane asked, his voice a low hiss that made her skin crawl. Your mother was so brave. She thought she could hide you in the mud. She thought if she stayed in that cellar, I would forget about the daughter she left behind. But then she realized that a moon blessed never truly disappears. Because you're a thief, Lyra spat, her voice trembling but loud. Because you're a coward who hides behind shadows while better men bleed. My mother didn't hide me for you, she hid me from you. What followed was a snarl that ripped through Vane's chest. In fact, he didn't look like a man anymore. His shoulders widened and his teeth grew into jagged yellow stakes. Not only that, but the enemy wolves around Caspian began to growl, their milky eyes fixed on Lyra's glowing throat. Even so, Lyra didn't back down. Have you ever stood in front of a fire and realized you were the one who had to put it out? Because she loved Caspian, she felt a surge of power that made the silver-veined stones in the wall crack. Truth be told, she was terrified, but she was more afraid of losing the man who had seen her cracks and called them beautiful. He was a king without a kingdom. She was a girl without a soul. They were survivors in a world of ghosts. More importantly, she saw Caspian's obsidian wolf form struggle to rise, his black blood staining the white snow like ink. She is mine, Vane roared, his voice shaking the trees until the dead leaves fell like rain. I took her mother, and I will take the daughter. Because the moon blessed are meant to be used, not to rule. You are a battery, Lyra, nothing more. Before she could move, Vane lunged. Soon after, the courtyard exploded into a mess of fur and silver light. In that moment, Lyra realized she wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for her mother's ghost. What's worse, she saw the first open loop. Vane wasn't just here to kill them. He was trying to activate the locket using her proximity. Still, the silver light from her palms hit him, but he didn't fall. Instead, he absorbed the light, his skin turning a sickly gray as he drank her magic. Moments later, the ground began to shake. She didn't know what scared her more, the monster in front of her or the way her own blood felt like it was trying to escape her skin. Without warning, the silver locket in Vane's hand snapped open. By the time Lyra realized what was happening, a scream echoed from inside the jewelry, a voice that sounded exactly like her mother's. It was a hollow, haunting sound that made her knees weak. Next, a cloud of black smoke poured out, coiling around Lyra's ankles like cold snakes. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she tried to push the smoke away, but it was too thick. What followed was the truth as it unraveled. Vane didn't kill her mother. In fact, he had trapped her soul inside the locket to use as a compass to find the rest of the bloodline. Which meant Lyra hadn't just been hiding. She had been being tracked her entire life. Every time she felt lonely, the locket hummed. Every time she felt afraid, the locket glowed. You've been my little beacon for 5 years, Vane mocked, his eyes glowing with a cruel light. Every time you cried, the locket hummed. Every time you bled, the locket glowed. I let you stay in that village because I wanted your power to ripen. I wanted you to grow until your blood was thick enough to wake the dark moon. As the silence roared, Lyra felt a hole open up in her heart. Because she had been a tool for the enemy, she felt a wave of guilt that almost made her drop her guard. Rather than giving up, she looked at Caspian. He was back in his human form, leaning against a stone pillar, his chest heaving. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, and their eyes locked. The moment their eyes locked, she saw the truth. He didn't care about her blood. He didn't care about the heir. He cared about the girl who liked to hide in the gardens. Her heart skipped a beat. "Don't listen to him, Lyra," Caspian shouted, his voice rough with pain and blood. "You are more than what he did to you. You are the light that he can't extinguish." As her wolf stirred, Lyra felt a new kind of power. Not the silver light of her blood, but the red fire of her own rage. Before either could speak, she let out a scream that wasn't a cry for help. It was a war cry that rattled the windows of the citadel. As if fate demanded it, the ground beneath Vane's feet shattered into 1,000 pieces. But then, Vane used the black smoke to pull her toward him, his claws reaching for her throat. To make things worse, the enemy wolves closed in on Caspian again. Still, Lyra wasn't a scavenger anymore. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. She felt it, etched in fire, the need to protect her mate. Suddenly, she threw her hands out, creating a massive dome of silver light that pushed everything back. It was like a giant glass bowl made of stars. What's worse, the dome began to shrink, pulling her and Caspian together while pushing the darkness out. Eventually, the dome collapsed into a single point of light, and they were gone, teleported into the deep, dark catacombs beneath the citadel. The air in the catacombs was cold and smelled of damp earth and ancient magic. It was so quiet she could hear the drip of water hitting a stone a mile away. In the stillness that followed, Lyra collapsed onto the stone floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. With his scent in the air, she knew Caspian was close. Moments later, she felt his hand on her shoulder, heavy, warm, and trembling. In that moment, the space between them burned. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she turned to him, her eyes still glowing with the fading light of the battle. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "I have to heal you. I have to make it stop." "Lyra, stop," Caspian groaned, sliding down the wall to sit beside her. "You've given too much. Your blood, it's dimming. If you give more, you won't be able to shift back. You'll just be gone." As her wolf pressed forward, she didn't listen. Without thinking, she pulled his hand toward her, pressing her glowing palm against the deep gash on his chest. Because she needed him to survive, as she poured every ounce of her life force into the wound. What followed was a sizzling sound as the skin began to knit back together. Actually, it felt like she was giving him pieces of her own soul. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she felt a deep emotional connection that was more than just a bond. It was love, raw, messy, and terrifying. She felt his pain, his fear, and his secret hope. "Why would you do that?" Caspian asked, his voice soft as he watched the silver light vanish into his skin. "I brought you here to be a vessel. I treated you like a tool in a shop window." "No," Lyra said, her voice finally steady. "You treated me like a person. You saw my scar and didn't look away. You saw my fear and gave me a place to hide. Because you chose me, I'm choosing you, not as a king, but as my mate." As her wolf stirred, she leaned her head against his shoulder, savoring the solid, real presence of him. In the quiet that followed, she realized the second open loop. If her mother's soul was in that locket, then Vane could still find them, no matter how deep they hid. Which meant the catacombs weren't a sanctuary, they were a trap. Still, at this moment, she didn't care. As her soul answered, she felt Caspian's arm wrap around her, pulling her close. The tension broke as he kissed the top of her head. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she realized the shadow's surrogate was gone. Instead, The bloody queen was starting to realize that to save her mother and her king, she would have to do more than just bleed silver. She would have to become a monster herself. What's worse, a low scratching sound began to echo from the dark tunnel ahead. Without warning, the red-eyed crow landed on a nearby torch, its eyes reflecting the silver light still pulsing in Lyra's veins. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Lyra knew the hunt was back on and the walls were closing in. The red eyes of the crow were the only things glowing in the dark, watching them like a hungry ghost. In that moment, Lyra felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold stone walls. The catacombs were old, smelling of wet earth, and the copper tang of dried blood that had been there for 100 years. Soon after, she pulled her hand away from Caspian's chest, watching the last of the silver light sink into his skin. His wounds were gone, but he still looked tired, his face pale under the soot and grime of the fight. Without thinking, she reached out to touch his cheek, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. Have you ever felt like you were standing on the edge of a cliff, just waiting for the wind to push you off? Lyra felt that way now, her heart banging against her ribs like a trapped bird. "We can't stay here," she whispered, her voice sounding small in the giant tunnel. "That crow, it is Vane's eyes. He knows exactly where we are because my blood is like a signal fire in the dark." As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she stood up, her legs feeling like jelly. What's worse, the silver locket was still out there holding her mother's voice in a cage of dark magic. Still, Caspian grabbed her hand, pulling her back toward him. His grip was strong and warm, a big contrast to the icy air of the tomb. Actually, he looked worried, his golden eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity that made her breath catch. "Lyra, your blood is too weak right now because you gave so much to heal me," Caspian growled softly, his voice echoing off the damp stone. "If we move, you'll be exposed. Vane is hunting the scent of the moon, and right now you are a lighthouse in a storm." "I have to go back for her," Lyra said, her voice growing firm. "I heard her voice, Caspian. My mother is in that locket. Because he stole her, I have to steal her back. Because she protected me, I have to protect her. Because I am the last moon blessed. I am the only one who can fix this." What followed was a silence that felt like a physical weight pressing on her chest. Before either could speak, a low, rumbling growl echoed from the tunnel behind them, vibrating through the floorboards of her soul. Without warning, the red-eyed crow let out a harsh scream and flew into the darkness like a black arrow. Moments later, the sound of scratching claws grew louder. In fact, the enemy wolves hadn't lost the trail. They were just playing with their food. That's why Lyra felt a surge of cold fury. She was tired of being the prey. She was tired of hiding in the mud. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she looked at the ancient stone pillars around them. They were carved with symbols of the moon, symbols that looked just like the ones in the archive keeper's old book. "I can hide us," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I can use the blood left in me to wake the stones. It will mask our scent, but it will take everything I have left." As if fate demanded it, Caspian stood up. In that moment, he looked like the king she had first seen in the village square. Tall, powerful, and terrifying. Yet when he looked at her, his expression was soft like a prayer. She didn't know what scared her more, the monsters in the dark, or the way she was starting to love the man holding her hand. "Then we do it together," he said, his voice a promise. The space between them burned, and she let it happen. leaning into him as they walked deeper into the dark, toward the heart of the mountain. What's worse, she could hear Vane's voice echoing in her head, a cold promise of the pain that was coming. Under the weight of his stare, Lyra knelt in the center of a circular chamber that smelled of ancient pine and starlight. Next, she saw the altar. It was a flat slab of white stone that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own. In fact, and this was the moon well, the place where her ancestors had prayed for 1,000 years. After that, she looked at Caspian, who was standing guard at the entrance. His obsidian wolf fur was starting to sprout along his arms, his muscles bunching like coiled snakes. Still, the air was thick with the smell of old magic and the feeling of eyes watching from the shadows. Because the land needed her, she pressed her bleeding palm against the cold stone of the altar. Truth be told, it felt like the stone was drinking her blood. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, the silver light poured out of her, filling the grooves in the floor like glowing rivers. "It's working," she gasped, her vision starting to blur at the edges. Soon after, the entire room began to glow with a soft, pearly light. As the silence roared, she felt the silver bane in the walls start to vibrate, but this time it didn't hurt. Instead, it felt like a shield being wrapped around her shoulders, which meant they were finally invisible to Vane's tracking. But then the cost hit her. As her wolf stirred, Lyra felt her strength vanish like smoke in a windstorm. In the span of a breath, she fell forward, but Caspian was there to catch her. With his scent in the air, she felt safe for the first time in her life. As her pulse raced, he pulled her into his lap, his large hands cradling her head. "You did it, Lyra," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "You saved us again." "I'm so tired, Caspian," she murmured, her eyes fluttering shut. "I just want to go home, but I don't know where home is anymore." "Home is here," he said, eye pressing his forehead against hers. The moment their eyes locked, she saw a future she hadn't dared to dream of while she was sleeping in the mud. She saw a green forest. She saw a palace full of light. She saw a child with golden eyes and silver hair. Maybe it was fate, but she realized that she wasn't just his surrogate or his queen. She was his soul. Because he was her anchor, she didn't fall into the dark. Rather, she felt a sizzling heat pass between them, a bond so strong it felt like it was etched into her bones. Time stood still as he leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the kiss of a king taking what was his. It was the kiss of a man thanking the stars for a miracle. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Lyra kissed him back, her hands tangling in his dark hair. The air thickened with their shared desire, a burning fire that the cold catacombs couldn't touch. At that moment, she made a choice. She wouldn't be the broken girl from the hovel anymore. She wouldn't be the vessel. Instead, she would be the woman who fought for her king. "I'm going to kill him," she whispered against his lips. "I'm going to take my mother back, and I'm going to kill Vane for what he did to us." As her wolf pressed forward, she felt Caspian's growl answer her own. Still, the peace didn't last long. To make things worse, the first open loop returned to her mind. The archive keeper hadn't just been a librarian. She was her mother's sister, which meant the blood in these walls was family blood. In the quiet that followed, a new voice whispered from the shadows, a voice that didn't belong to Vane or her mother. Without warning, the glowing silver rivers in the floor turned a dark, oily black. She felt it, etched in fire, The realization that Vane hadn't just been tracking her, he had been waiting for her to wake the moonwell. What followed was the sound of stone cracking like a giant bone. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Lyra scrambled to her feet, leaning on Caspian for support. Next, she saw the black smoke from the locket pouring out of the cracks in the floor. As the wind shifted, the red-eyed crow flew into the room, landing on the altar. In fact, it wasn't a crow anymore. It was a messenger for something much older and hungrier. "You've opened the door, Lyra," the messenger's voice echoed, sounding like 1,000 dying screams. "The moonwell is no longer a shield, it is a bridge." To make things worse, the second open loop revealed itself. The blood frenzy wasn't just a sickness. It was a hungry spirit that Vane was trying to let loose into the world. Because she had used her blood to wake the well, she had accidentally given the spirit a way out. What followed was a high-energy sequence of the walls, starting to crumble into dust. As if fate demanded it, Caspian shifted fully into his obsidian wolf form, his body twice as large as it had been before. With every heartbeat, the room felt smaller as the black smoke rose like a tide. "We have to go," Lyra shouted, her voice trembling. "We have to get to the surface before the mountain collapses." As her wolf stirred, she realized she couldn't run. No matter how hard she tried, her legs wouldn't move because the smoke was like heavy iron. The black smoke was wrapping around her ankles, pulling her down into the moonwell. She didn't know what scared her more, the idea of dying or the idea of Caspian watching her go. Before the words left her lips, she looked at the obsidian wolf. In that moment, she saw the sacrifice he was about to make. As if pulled by a string, Caspian lunged into the smoke, his teeth snapping at the shadows. "Go, Lyra," he roared in her mind, his bond voice shaking her soul. "Run to the surface. Find the guard. I will hold the bridge." She felt it, etched in fire, the pain of his commitment. Because she couldn't leave him, she stayed. Instead of running, she reached into the black smoke with her glowing hands. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she grabbed onto his fur, her silver light clashing with the darkness. The tension broke as the altar exploded into a million pieces. What followed was a fall into a bottomless dark. Between one breath and the next, the world vanished. In the stillness that followed, the only thing she could feel was Caspian's heart beating against hers as they plummeted into the unknown. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Lyra realized they were no longer in the catacombs, which meant the war had moved to a place where the rules of the living didn't apply. That night, the moonwell was silent, but the shadows were just beginning to scream. Falling felt like a dream that wouldn't end, a long, cold plunge into a sea of ink. In that moment, Lyra's world didn't just break. It vanished. The air was gone, replaced by a rushing wind that smelled like old graves and cold iron. After that, she felt a heavy weight slamming into her side. It was Caspian. His obsidian fur was rough against her skin, and his heart was a frantic, thumping drum against her ribs. Soon after, the darkness swallowed them whole. Have you ever fallen so far that you forgot what the ground felt like? Lyra did. Without thinking, she wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his thick mane. Because the bond was a lifeline, she could feel his terror as clearly as her own. As if fate demanded it, they hit the bottom, but there was no crash. Between one breath and the next, the world stopped moving. Moments later, Lyra opened her eyes. The floor wasn't stone anymore. It was gray sand that felt like crushed bone. Time stood still as she tried to sit up, her head spinning like a top. With his scent in the air, she looked for Caspian. He was lying a few feet away, still in his wolf form, but his obsidian fur looked dull and dusty. Her heart skipped a beat because his chest wasn't moving. As if pulled by a string, she crawled toward him on her hands and knees. Truth be told, she had never been this scared in her life. Not when she was a scavenger, not when she was a prisoner, not even when she was face to face with Vane. In fact, the silence here was louder than any roar. Not only that, but the sky above them wasn't a sky at all. It was a swirling ceiling of gray fog that seemed to press down on her shoulders. Caspian? She whispered, her voice sounding like a ghost's. Please, please wake up. To make things worse, he didn't move. Before she could move, she touched his nose. It was cold. What's worse, she couldn't feel the bond. It was like a string had been cut, leaving her floating in the dark, deep down, and she knew the truth. They were in the between, the spirit realm where the moon-blessed went when their light was almost gone. Her soul answered with a hollow ache. She remembered a story her mother told her once about a wolf who traveled to the gray woods to find his lost mate. He had to give up his voice just to stay. At that moment, Lyra realized she might have to give up more than that. As her wolf stirred, she felt a cold shadow fall over her. As if summoned, a tall figure in a white mask appeared from the fog. This was the first open loop. Who was this masked spirit? And why did he have Lyra's mother's eyes? What followed was a silence so thick it felt like it would choke her. "You shouldn't be here, little moon," the spirit said. His voice didn't come from his mouth, it echoed inside her head. "I won't leave him," Lyra said, her voice trembling but hard. "Help him. Use my blood. Take it all if you have to." As her wolf pressed forward, the spirit laughed. It sounded like dry leaves. Because the land was hungry for a sacrifice, the spirit pointed at Caspian's heart. And she let it happen, her hands starting to glow with a tiny, flickering silver light. In the quiet that followed, she realized she was a surrogate. She was a weapon. She was a queen. But most importantly, she was a woman who was about to lose everything. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she pressed her palms to Caspian's fur, praying to a moon she couldn't see. Her body moved on instinct as she began to hum her mother's song. In the stillness that followed, the gray sand around them began to swirl. Soon after, the masked spirit vanished, leaving behind a single white petal. What's worse, a new vision began to form in the fog. Lyra saw a woman with long silver hair standing near a tree that looked like it was made of glass. At that moment, her breath caught. It was her mother. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Lyra tried to run to her. "Mama!" she cried out. "Is it really you?" But then, the woman turned around, and her face was a black void. She didn't know what scared her more, the sight of the void or the way the woman started to walk toward her. As her pulse raced, the woman reached out a hand. Because she wanted her mother's love, Lyra didn't pull away. Instead, she felt a cold, draining sensation. Truth be told, this wasn't her mother. It was a shadow, a dark reflection of her mother's pain trapped in the locket. What followed was a relevant story. The first time Lyra's mother shifted, she had accidentally killed a flower she loved. She had cried for days, and her father had told her that power always costs something. In fact, Lyra was paying that cost now. Not only that, but the shadow started to speak with her mother's voice. "Give me the light, Lyra," the shadow whispered. "Give it to me, and the pain will stop. You can stay here with me forever. No more alphas, no more wars, just us. As the truth unraveled, Lyra realized the shadow was trying to steal her moon-blessed essence to power Vane in the real world. Even so, she felt a part of her wanting to give in. Because she was so tired of fighting, the idea of resting in the gray woods seemed like a gift. What's worse, she looked back at Caspian. He was still a silent obsidian statue. Deep down, she knew the truth. If she stayed, he would never wake up. He would be a ghost in a gray world. As her wolf stirred, she saw the second open loop. A mark on the gray bark of the glass tree that looked like a map. It was a map of the Citadel's hidden tunnels. Before the words left her lips, she realized her mother had left this for her. "No," Lyra said, pulling her hand back. "You're not her. My mother would never ask me to give up." As the echo faded, the shadow let out a scream that shattered the glass tree. As her soul answered, Lyra felt a sudden jolt of energy, which meant the bond wasn't dead, it was just buried. Still, the shadow lunged at her. In the span of a breath, Lyra felt a massive weight push her aside. With his scent in the air, she saw a black blur. It was Caspian. He was awake, but his eyes weren't gold anymore. They were a dull, flat gray. The tension broke as he stood between her and the shadow, his growl sounding like a tectonic plate shifting. As if fate demanded it, they were fighting together, even in the land of the dead. But then, the ground began to dissolve beneath them. Without thinking, Lyra grabbed Caspian's fur as they started to sink into the gray sand. In that moment, her world tilted. What followed was the sound of Vane's voice, coming from the real world above. Because he was winning, his voice was loud and arrogant. Not only that, but she could feel the citadel burning. She could feel the blackguard falling. She could feel the blood-frenzy spirit laughing. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she realized they were being pulled back, but not to victory. Soon after, they landed back in the catacombs. As the sky darkened, or what passed for sky in the tunnels, Lyra saw Vane. He was standing over the moonwell, and he was holding the silver locket. Under the weight of his stare, Lyra felt her light flicker and die. In fact, it was gone. She was just a girl again, just a scavenger. To make things worse, Caspian shifted back into his human form, but he was too weak to stand. He fell to his knees, his head hanging low. "Look at you," Vane mocked, stepping toward them. "A broken king and a hollow queen. You gave everything to a ghost, Lyra. And now you have nothing left for your people." As fire bloomed beneath her skin, or where the fire used to be, Lyra felt a cold, dead weight in her chest. Because she had lost her light, she couldn't fight. Because she had lost her mother's ghost, she couldn't hope. Because the bond was silent, she was alone. Truth be told, this was her lowest point. Have you ever lost the one thing that made you special? Lyra had. She was empty. What's worse, Vane raised his hand, and the black smoke from the locket began to wrap around Caspian's throat. "Stop it!" Lyra cried, but her voice was weak. "Why?" Vane asked with a smile. "He's just a dog now, Lyra, and you're just a vessel with a leak." As the silence roared, Lyra watched the man she loved gasp for air. She felt it, etched in fire, the realization that she had failed. He had chosen her. He had protected her. He had loved her, and she had led him into a trap. As the truth unraveled, she saw the red-eyed crow land on Vane's shoulder, cawing in triumph. In the quiet that followed, Lyra fell to her knees in the dirt, which meant the war was over. As if the world narrowed, she saw Vane lift the locket high. Between one breath and the next, he prepared to crush it, and with it, the last of her mother's soul. The air thickened with the scent of sulfur and defeat. As the echo faded, Lyra closed her eyes, waiting for the end. The silver locket hung in the air, a tiny piece of metal that held the weight of the entire world. In that moment, Lyra watched Vane's fingers tighten around it, his knuckles turning white and jagged like sun-bleached bone. She could hear her mother's voice crying out from inside the jewelry, a soft, broken sound that felt like a needle driven straight into her heart. After that, she looked at Caspian. He was on the ground, his face turning a sickly, bruised blue as the black smoke squeezed the life from his throat. Have you ever felt so helpless that you wanted to scream until the stars fell from the sky? Lyra did. Next, she looked at the white scar on her own hand. It wasn't glowing. It was just a mark of old pain and mud. But then, she remembered what Caspian had said in the quiet of the carriage. The cracks are where the light gets in. Truth be told, she had been looking at her blood as a weapon, but she had forgotten that her soul was the true fire. Because she loved him, she didn't just feel fear. She felt a burning, liquid heat. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, something deep and ancient inside her finally shifted into place. In fact, it wasn't her blood that started to glow this time. It was the scar itself. The white line on her face and the one on her hand began to shine with a light so bright it made Vane stagger back, his eyes watering. What's worse, the black smoke around Caspian's neck began to sizzle and melt away like wax near a flame. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Lyra wasn't just a vessel. She wasn't just a girl with special blood to be drained. Rather, she was the crack in the world that was letting the moon's true power through. Because her pain was her strength, she stood up, her eyes turning a pure, blinding white that held no shadow. "Let him go," Lyra said. Her voice didn't tremble like a scavenger's anymore. It sounded like a mountain moving against the earth. As the silence roared, Vane let out a hiss of agony. The locket in his hand grew so hot that it glowed red, and he had to drop it to the floor. Moments later, it hit the stone with a loud clink that echoed through the chamber. Without thinking, Lyra lunged forward. She felt it, etched in fire, the knowledge that she only had one chance to reclaim her past. Before either could speak, she snatched the locket from the ground. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, the black smoke tried to bite her fingers, but her white light burned it into nothingness. As a result, Vane let out a roar of pure fury. Not only that, but he shifted into his monster form, a gray beast with too many teeth and eyes like rotten meat. Still, Lyra didn't back down. Because the bond pulsed, she felt Caspian's strength flowing back into her limbs. With a single glance, she saw him stand up, his obsidian wolf fur bristling with a terrifying new life. As her wolf stirred, Lyra realized they couldn't finish this fight here in the dark of the catacombs. In the stillness that followed, she remembered the map her mother had left on the glass tree in the spirit realm. Next, she saw a hidden door in the corner, covered in thick spider webs and the dust of centuries. As if fate demanded it, she knew exactly where it led. Soon after, she grabbed Caspian's hand, pulling him toward the wall. Before the words left her lips, she whispered the ancient command her mother had taught her in the dream of white petals. Without warning, the stone wall slid open, revealing a tunnel that smelled of fresh pine and cold, biting wind. In fact, it was the secret path to the surface world. What followed was a frantic run through the dark. No matter how hard she tried, she could still hear Vane's heavy claws scraping against the stone behind them, getting closer with every step. "We're almost there," she shouted, her breath hitching as her lungs burned. As the wind shifted, she felt the air grow colder and fresher. More importantly, she felt the moon's presence high above them, waiting to pour its strength into her soul. Despite that, Caspian was struggling to keep up because of his wounds, which meant she had to be the strong one now. Because he was her anchor, she kept her grip tight on his hand, refusing to let go. Still, the tunnel felt like it was miles long. What's worse, the black smoke was starting to fill the tunnel behind them, coiling like a hungry snake in the dark. By the time they reached the end, Lyra could see a tiny circle of moonlight at the top of a long iron ladder. As her pulse raced, she began to climb. She would fight for her mother. She would fight for her king. She would fight for herself. Beneath the moonlight, she burst out onto the roof of the citadel. At the same time, Caspian scrambled up behind her, shifting back into his human form with a pained grunt. The tension broke as they stood in the high battlements, looking down at the war below. In fact, the Black Guard was losing. The enemy wolves were everywhere, tearing through the gates like a flood of gray, mangy fur. To make things worse, Vane's monster form burst through the roof just a few feet away, his claws digging deep into the stone. As if fate demanded it, Lyra stood her ground. She didn't know what scared her more, the giant monster or the weight of saving everyone she had ever known. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was the only one who could turn the tide of this bloody night. Under the weight of his stare, Lyra held the silver locket high above her head like a torch. Soon after, the red-eyed crow landed on a nearby gargoyle, its beak snapping in a mocking, hollow laugh. Instead of letting it scare her, Lyra focused on the warmth of the metal in her hand. Because it was the key, she began to sing the final verse of her mother's song, the one about the moon returning to the earth. As the echo faded, the locket began to glow with a silver light that was so pure, it was hard to look at. What followed was a change in the very air. Not only that, but the enemy wolves in the courtyard below stopped fighting and looked up at the roof. Between them, something cracked. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, the silver light from the locket shot up into the sky, hitting the full moon like a giant, shimmering arrow. "Blackguard to me!" Lyra's voice boomed, carrying over the sounds of the dying and the brave. Jordi, as her soul answered, she saw the remaining soldiers look up from the mud. The moment their eyes locked, they saw the bloody queen they had been promised in the old legends. Because she was their light, they felt a new surge of hope that burned away their exhaustion. In that moment, they began to fight back with a fury that pushed the gray wolves toward the cliff's edge. Still, Vane was right in front of her. What followed was a high-energy sequence as he lunged, his massive claws swiping at her throat. Before either could speak, Caspian jumped between them, his obsidian wolf form meeting Vane's gray monster in midair. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Lyra realized she couldn't just stand and watch. Without another word, she closed her eyes and reached out with her mind. As her wolf pressed forward, she connected with the spirits of the forest and the land. As her bones remembered him, she felt Caspian's pain, and she used her light to heal him while he was still fighting, which meant he couldn't be killed as long as she was standing on this roof. Truth be told, it was the most beautiful and terrifying thing she had ever done. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she felt her mother's hand on her shoulder, a ghostly touch that gave her the final push. With every heartbeat, the locket grew brighter and brighter. As the sky darkened, a massive shadow began to form behind Lyra, the spirit of the first queen. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. As her wolf stirred, Lyra looked at Vane and realized he wasn't a god. He was just a sad, greedy man who was afraid of the very dark he served. And she let it happen. On her white light expanding until it covered the entire roof like a blanket of stars. What followed was a silence so deep it felt like the world had gone underwater. As if fate demanded it, her final plan was in motion. Before the words left her lips, she saw the opening she had been waiting for in Vane's guard. In the quiet that followed, she prepared to end the war once and for all. The silver light from the locket was a roar that nobody could hear, but everyone could feel in their teeth. In that moment, Lyra stood on the edge of the high roof, her white eyes fixed on the gray monster that had spent years trying to eat her soul. Vane was a tower of matted fur and jagged yellow teeth, and his breath smelled like a swamp full of dead things. After that, he lunged with a scream, his massive claws swiping through the air with a sound like a whip cracking against stone. Before she could move, Caspian's obsidian wolf form intercepted him in midair, the two giant beasts crashing together in a tangle of fur and bone-snapping fury. Because she finally accepted her own power, Lyra didn't pull back or hide her scarred face in the dirt like a scared child. Instead, she raised her glowing hands toward the sky, her scars shining like liquid stars. She was no longer the girl who hid in the mud. She was no longer the vessel. She was no longer afraid. Soon after, she saw the black smoke coiling around Vane's throat, but her silver light was eating it away like fire through paper. Truth be told, the monster looked smaller and weaker now that she wasn't looking at him with the eyes of a broken scavenger. Next, Lyra poured every bit of her soul and her memories into the melting locket. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, the metal began to turn into a river of pure moonlight that flowed down her arms and pooled at her feet, which meant the cage Vane had built was finally breaking into 1,000 pieces. Without warning, a blinding flash of white light hit the courtyard below, turning every enemy wolf into a whimpering pile of gray fur. As her wolf stirred, she felt the spirit of her mother standing right behind her, a warm presence that smelled like summer rain and forest flowers. Because the shadow could not survive the true light, Vane began to shrink and howl, his monster form falling apart like wet cardboard in a storm. As the silence roared, Caspian pinned the smaller, trembling man to the stone, his golden eyes burning with the justice that had been a long time coming. Have you ever seen a nightmare dissolve right in front of your eyes? Lyra watched it happen, her heart beating a happy rhythm against her ribs that felt like a drum. In fact, the air felt clean and sweet for the first time in her entire life. Soon after the last enemy wolf fled into the dark, the courtyard fell into a quiet that felt like a prayer. In that moment, Lyra ran to Caspian as he shifted back into his human form, his body steaming in the cold air. He was covered in scratches and black blood, but his eyes were bright and clear for the first time since she met him. Next, she threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in the crook of his shoulder while the smell of cedar and home filled her nose. As her soul answered, she felt his large, warm arms wrap around her waist, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. After that, they walked toward the broken stone altar where the archive keeper was waiting for them. Still, the old woman was smiling through her silk blindfold, her hands reaching out to find the girl she had protected from afar. Because the locket was finally open, a soft, glowing spirit floated in the air, the true, beautiful form of Lyra's mother. Still, the old woman reached out and touched the spirit's hand. "You did it, my brave girl," the spirit whispered, her voice like a soft breeze through the trees. Before the words left her lips, Lyra felt a peace in her chest that she had never known while sleeping in the hovels. Truth be told, she wanted to hold on to the spirit forever, but she knew her mother had to go to the real moonwell in the stars. And instead of crying, she smiled and let go, watching the silver light drift up toward the moon, which meant the first open loop was finally closed. The archive keeper was indeed her aunt, and together they would rule the forest. Because the bond was finally whole, Lyra felt a surge of life return to the grass and the trees below the citadel. What's worse, or rather, what was better, was the way the dead roses in the garden began to grow red petals right before their eyes. In fact, the shadow weight was gone, and the land was breathing again. "Is she truly gone?" Caspian asked softly, his hand resting on the small of Lyra's back. "She is home," Lyra answered, looking at the silver stars and the bright, round moon. "And so are we, Caspian. We are finally home." As the silence stretched, she realized she wasn't a surrogate anymore. She was a partner. She was a savior. More importantly, she was a woman who knew her own worth was more than just her blood. Next, they turned to the remaining blackguard who were standing in the courtyard. With a single glance, the soldiers knelt in the mud, not out of fear of a king, but out of respect for the queen who had bled for them. As her wolf stirred, Lyra felt a sense of belonging that was better than any palace or gold crown. Maybe it was fate, but she realized that the Bloody Queen wasn't a title about killing. It was a title about the fire of life that burns in the heart of the moon. As if summoned, a tiny white flower bloomed at her feet, right in the middle of the broken stone and the battle scars. Before she could move, she picked it up and tucked it behind Caspian's ear. The air thickened with a deep, emotional promise that they would never be alone again. Come morning, the sun rose over a kingdom that was no longer gray. At that moment, Lyra stood in the high balcony of her new home, watching the deer and the elk return to the greening valleys. After that, she felt Caspian's warmth behind her, his large arms sliding around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. Soon after, she leaned her head against him, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart that was now hers. Still, she looked at the white scar on her hand and smiled, because it didn't look like an ugly mark anymore. It was a map of where she had been and a promise of where she was going next. In fact, the land was breathing. The forest was growing. The kingdom was finally waking up from its long, dark sleep. Because she chose to stay, the moon-blessed line would never have to hide in the mud ever again. "What are you thinking about, my queen?" Caspian asked, his voice a low, happy rumble against her ear. "I'm thinking about the girl in the hovel," Lyra said, her voice steady and clear like a bell. "I'm thinking about how she thought she was broken and useless. Truth be told, she was just waiting for the right light to show her she was a masterpiece all along." "You were always a masterpiece to me," Caspian whispered, turning her around to face him. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, he kissed her, a long, slow kiss that tasted like 100 years of happy mornings, which meant the second open loop was finally resolved. The blood frenzy was locked away, and only the queen's love could keep the spirit of the dark at bay. Because he was her anchor, she never had to be afraid of the shadows ever again. As her wolf pressed forward, she felt the tiny, glowing life growing inside her, the heir they had promised, a child born of true love and silver light. Can a heart truly be broken if it still knows how to beat for someone else? Looking back, would you have changed a single moment of the pain if it led you to this? Lyra knew the answer, and she felt it in the warmth of the sun on her face. Eventually, they walked back into the palace, ready to rule as equals in a world of light. What followed was a lifetime of green springs and warm, cozy winters. In the stillness that followed, Lyra realized that she had painted the throne room red, not with the blood of her enemies, but with the fire of her own spirit. And she let it happen. The story of the Shadow's surrogate ending, and the story of the Moon Queen finally beginning. As if the world narrowed, she saw only her king, and she knew that they would be happy,